Okay, so I'm going to try my best to explain how I do the top stitching on the placket for the Pretty Little Layers dress. So in the pattern, this is from the A0, but it's obviously in the A4, this is the template. And in the instructions, I've put a more detailed, it's not to scale, so you can't use that, you actually have to use the template. But for me, I found that having all of these measurements helped me to transfer that onto my fabric. So that's the first bit I was going to talk about. So you need to have the pattern template and you need the instructions from the instruction booklet. And then the other thing that I have just recently started using is this hot iron ruler, which really helps me when you have to fold over these sections here to make sure I'm really accurate. So that's the other thing. So by this stage you would have cut out your front bodice and it will be on the fold, and I like to press that so that I know when I open it up I've got a really good guide as to where I'm placing everything. And the first thing I want to do is make sure I block fuse my fabric for the placket. So I don't like mucking about with tiny little strips. I figure it's such a lightweight interfacing that it's going to help with the stability of the top stitching, even if the whole thing is. So probably not proper, but that's the way I do it. And I just get a piece of fabric that's roughly the size of what I'm going to be working with, and a piece of interfacing that's roughly that size as well. And I'm going to iron that on and block fuse this piece of fabric. Okay, so I've trimmed down this piece of the fabric for the placket. I've attached or ironed on the interfacing to the wrong side, and now I need to transfer this template onto here. I cannot believe I've run out of interfacing while I'm trying to do this. Very, very tight. So there's two ways you can do it. You can trace around this template and you can mark in the lines, but I don't find that easy. I like to refer back to all of these measurements, which is why I put this in the instructions, but of course everyone does things differently. So you do whatever works for you, but I just find that transferring and understanding from my brain where all these measurements are and what's happening just helps me during construction. So I kind of just make sure that I'm, got enough fabric and I'm where I need to be. And then I just start by drawing a straight line, the longest point. And then I refer back to my template and I can see that it's 0.5. So I will measure 0.5. And if you're working in inches, then you can convert to the closest. I think it's about a 1/4 inch, and then it's a 1 inch across for the 2.5 centimeters. They don't really matter as long as you get their proportions right. So I've done those two lines, and now I'm going to go ahead and measure 2.5 centimeters. And I'm going to draw that line. Again, ideally, this is covering your interfacing is covering your whole piece, but I'm working with what I've got. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to transfer all of these lines onto here. Okay, so once all the lines have been drawn on and you've got your long section and then your shorter section roughly done, again, some people are probably much more specific and careful than me, but this is what works for me, so it might work for you. I then will line that up and work out that is my guide for the top, and this is my guide for the bottom. I might need to put that extra 0.5 in there. It's just a turn. I think the more you do this, the more you understand the construction of it all, so it seems less daunting. Now, to transfer this point, so this is the cutting line, and I've marked on here deepest point of opening. So as it suggests, that's where the neckline will open to. I mean, this kind of fold, the tabs fold over, so even though it might seem quite low, it doesn't feel super low to me. But again, if you don't like it that low, all you have to do is you just transfer that point up and that line up to where you want to. So I would measure up 3 centimeters from that line onto the cutting line, and that's the highest point there, and then draw a line across, and that's just a cutting guide. So it tells you there that's a cutting line, cutting into the corners, and that'll make sense when you have to do that. So that's all looking pretty good. And now I'm going to go ahead and cut out the outside of this, and then I can start folding in the lines. Okay, so now you need to press in some of these folds, and again referring to this guide. So it says here this part will be folded first, this part will be folded first. So you don't have to use this. Before I discovered this, I used to just clip the line so I could easily fold up, but these are actually really amazing. And you can see that it tells you there it's 0.5, or maybe you can't see. And then you just have to press along. So you put the edge of it on the line, and then you press, and you get a really accurate straight line, which is good for someone like me. Needs to be a bit more careful, particularly this sort of work where you know, a few mil out can kind of make the difference between it looking really neat or not looking really neat. So I've done one side, and I'm just going to go ahead and do the other side. I also like to fold in this line. Once it's folded in, you do have to be careful that you don't catch it when you're sewing, but I just find you get a crisper edge doing it when it's nice and flat. So this is, well, like we measured out, referring back to this, it's 2.5. So when you're folding it over, it should hit that 2.5 mark, which it does. And then you know that the whole way down is going to be even and 2.5 centimeters. So I do that side, and I go ahead and do this side as well. And it's a really good sense check to see that this is going to be your stitch line, and if that falls short, then you know that there's something that hasn't quite worked. So the fact that that covers that, just covers it, means that we're on track for all of the folds and the measurements. Okay, so it's folded in. You've got a neat edge, and you've got two, and then we're going to make sure that we don't catch that. But it seems like a bit of a fiddle and a bit of prep, but it actually helps when you're going to stitch it, which we're going to pin now. Okay, so you've got your center bodice, your front bodice, and the center has been pressed, so you know where it is, and it's the wrong side facing up and the wrong side of the placket, so you will see the folds, and you need to line up the center point there to the center point there. Now, you need to make sure that this corner and this corner are on the edge of the neckline, so, and it requires a little bit of trimming, otherwise it could fall short. So I just make sure that that corner is lined up with that corner, and then just stick that through there, just to make sure that that's in the right spot, and then just making sure that that also is in the center. So this is our cut line, so those pins are just there to keep it in place, and you're going to pin, you're going to fold these back and Again, referring back to this so that you can remember what's going on, is this indicates the stitch line and this indicates the cut line. So the pins are just there to put it in place to make sure it's in the center, and then we're going to pin the stitch line. And I always like to pin in the direction that I'm going to sew. So I would start here. Just make sure everything underneath is flat. I'm doing a print mix for this version of the dress. So I've got the contrasting kind of chocolate brown placket with the pink, which I hope will be nice. And we're going to get down to this point here and we're going to pivot our needle and go across to here. So once you've got these pins in place, you probably don't need the central ones. I'm going to pin. So again, like I'm pinning the way that I'm going to stitch so that I can pull them out as I go along. And then you pin all the way up to the neckline. And now we can do some stitching. Okay, so I started at the top here and I've gone down, following the line, pivoted the needle, gone across, pivoted the needle, and I've come up again. So that's the stitching part done. And now we have to do the cutting part. So on the cutting line, again, referring back to here if you're not sure, but the line, the central line, you're going to start at the top, make sure that everything's flat, there's nothing that you're going to snip, everything's out of the way, and you're going to cut through the center until you get to the top of the triangle. And then you're going to clip into the corners, but being really careful not to go through that stitch, so as close as you can. And then we are going to be able to turn this back. So you've just cut through and through to the corners, and now we're going to flip it over and pull through the placket. And we're going to give the seams a press so that it all starts to go to where it's meant to go. So you press the seam towards the placket, away from the bodice, and on the other side. And it might feel like, oh, this is never going to come together, but magically it does. So this is where we need to start to play with these two tabs and get everything lined up. And if you're top stitching, this is where probably it's the most challenging bit, but all doable. If I can learn how to do it, you can all learn how to do it. So the most important thing is that you've pressed that flat towards the placket, and you want to make sure that the folded edge is sitting just beyond that stitch line. So fingers crossed it is. I mean, worst comes to worst, if you haven't, and you could like repress the folded area, but hopefully it's all aligned for you. So pin that one in place, and we're going to get on to the top stitching if you're going to do it. If you're not doing the top stitching, then you're just securing this in place. Okay, so you need to make sure that you're starting with the shorter tab. You'll see that the longer one has the extra bit. That's the bit that sits on top and kind of gets folded. So it's the shorter tab that you need to start with. And we're going to go over to the machine. We're going to secure this edge, and then we're going to do the rows of stitching about 4 millimeters apart. That again is up to you. That's kind of how I've worked out. I like the look of it, but you might want it less dense, and in which case you could do sort of 5 millimeters. It could be a little bit of trial and error. Doesn't really matter. It's very much a design feature. It's nothing to do with the construction. So we're going to secure the edge first. So it depends on the foot that you've got, but I like to sort of line up half the edge of it halfway of the width of that, so it's 2-3 mil in, and I'm just going to sew down that edge. I know then that I'm going to be catching the fold underneath, and I'm checking all the time that that seam line, that stitch line, is being covered by this fold. I can see that it's poking out a tiny bit there, so I just want to make sure that that's covered. And this will be the first row of the row of stitches. When you get down to the bottom, you need to make sure that everything's flat. You need to make sure that everything's out of the way. If this is not covered perfectly, like, don't stress.
Let's do our best for the overtime as well.
That's my machine talking to me. It will be covered when the long tab goes on the top. So now, if you're not doing the stitching, you've completed the shorter tab, and you can move on to the longer tab. If you are doing the top stitching, then we just need to go ahead and do as many rows as you want to. Again, I like to line up the center of the foot to, or the center of that side of the foot to that stitch mark. So it's not 5 mil. I've calculated it, it's around about 4 mil. And then I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to do all of these lines. So the top stitching's done. Where's the camera? Top stitching's done, and they're fairly even. You know, you've got to use however you want to do it, but yep, they're not too bad. Trim this up and trim the bottom, and then we'll go ahead. And then we'll go ahead and we'll do the long placket. Okay, so you've got the top, the short side, either top stitched or you've secured in place if you're not doing the top stitching, and then you've got this other bit floating around. So we need to fold it over the top of that. So this all just takes a lot of practice and time. The tab that you've just stitched sits on the inside. So there's nothing, sorry, it sits on the outside. There's nothing on the inside of this. I'll show you that in a second. So the inside actually has, and that's all out properly, has a really neat rectangle when it's all sort of pressed. So yeah, there's no tabs on the inside, everything is on the outside, but all gets covered up. So we need to just make sure that everything's sitting flat. That's the little triangle that you cut away into. That's the important bit to make sure that, so if this is pulling at these corners, just check that you've snipped into there enough. And then we need to make sure that this edge is secured the same way we did before. So we're going to go ahead and pin down this edge. Okay, once you've pinned this in place, even right down to the bottom, so everything's flat underneath, we're going to do the top stitching on this section, and then we can fold it over to secure it on top of the short section. So I'm going to start on this section here, so closest to the short tab. You just need to be very careful that you're not catching anything that you don't want to catch. Okay, so the long tab now has been stitched, top stitched all the way down, and now it's time to fold all of this together so that it all makes sense. So the short tab sits on the bottom and the long tab folds over the top of that. everything sits on the outside, so it doesn't get tucked in. So underneath is just this really neat rectangle or line where you cut, and the short tab goes there and the long tab goes over the top of it. So that's how it finishes. Now we need to finish down the bottom. I haven't quite caught that. We need to fold in the point. So you just do that and that until it's the way you want it. Line it up with the center front. So that the point should be in the center. And now we just need to secure these two pieces together. So you're going to find underneath the point where this meets and put a pin just above that point, and that's going to be where we sew across, and then we're going to secure this tab in place by going down to the point, across and up again. So I started on this side and went across, down, you can follow the stitching, down to the point, up, follow the stitching again and up, and then I just doubled back to make sure that it was secure. And that is the placket done. So the only thing to do before you put the collar on is just trim that down and that down, and you've done it. I just thought I'd show you underneath as well, so you can see that the tabs are tucked in there and that line of stitching is above that point to secure it in place.